And that's certainly the case with this remarkable sighting. A sighting that after almost 20 years remains a mystery even to the experts. It began as thousands of Australians were preparing to view one of the solar system's great spectacles, an eclipse of the sun. Among them, Nick Flaskus.
Being a keen amateur astronomer for many years, this was an opportunity in order to see a very rare event.
So early on the morning of October the 23rd, 1976, Nick set out with his best friend Frank Sinaras and Frank's younger brother Billy. They were bound for Ben Boyd National Park, near Eden on the New South Wales south coast. It was the perfect place to study and film the eclipse.
We had two cameras. We had a Super 8 camera which had never been used before. This was the very first time that Frank was using this film and camera. And we had a 35mm standard camera as well.
They may have been amateurs, but they were well prepared. Frank had bought special night film for his new movie camera, film that would be able to cope with the dramatic changes in light as the sun disappeared. Nick and Frank set up their equipment and explained once more to Billy that he'd damage his eyes if he looked directly at the sun during the eclipse.
Basically, because I couldn't look at the eclipse, and what I did was I turned around and looked out over the ocean, and as I looked out over the ocean, I saw these cloud, cigar-shaped figures.
So we looked at it and we thought, well, that's interesting. There was a kind of like a big bell, a heavy, dark, very dark object, a bell. And when we're looking at it, suddenly it wasn't as if there was one object, there was maybe two or three objects.
For a moment, the boys were stunned. Behind them, their cameras were set to film the eclipse. But in front of them, out over the ocean, there was something else. Something far more fascinating. Mysterious objects that had captured their imagination.
At that point, Nicholas and I said, yeah, let's go. So we turned the cameras around, and I said to Nick, I will never focus back on the sun again. He said, oh, it doesn't matter because this is more important.
First, they tried Nick's 35mm stills camera, but it was useless. So they concentrated on the Super 8. They were sure that with its zoom lens, they'd have more chance of success.
And as he's filming it and zooming in the lens towards it, there weren't two or three, there was something like 6 of these objects. One main one and 5 smaller ones.
Because it was the first time I'd ever used it, I panned, and as you'll see from the film, I was panning the horizon. So instead of concentrating on an object, that panning, there's a little bit of a distortion there. So you've really got to look for the UFO when you actually see the film.
The film is very grainy, and Frank's panning motion doesn't help the casual viewer to get a fix on the object. But when we zoom in electronically, it does become a little more distinct. To the naked eye, it may just seem like a blur, but as you'll see in a moment, it was enough to give the experts a clear picture of the shapes the boys filmed back in 1976.
It was like a bell. The main object was like a bell.
As they filmed, the boys were spellbound. But then they remembered the purpose of their expedition. They had only 3 minutes of Super 8 film, and the eclipse was well underway.
It was a wonderful experience looking at the eclipse. As the eclipse ended, we turned around again to look at what we saw, the objects. They weren't in the sky. We stayed there for about half an hour and nothing happened.
When the boys got their film back from the lab, naturally they were disappointed. What seemed so clear through the viewfinder looked so murky on celluloid. But even now, almost 20 years later, they have no doubt what they saw that day.
A dark greyish bell-shaped, a dome-shaped type object, just sort of sitting on the horizon. There were no bright lights, there were no colours.
You could see them actually rotating, And at one stage while we were filming, you could actually see them moving closer, backwards and forwards.
Since that day in 1976, many experts have studied this snippet of 8mm film, and eventually it was sent to America for evaluation. Investigators with the organisation called Ground Saucer Watch fed all the material into their computers. The grainy film was enhanced, and it was inspected and analysed, frame by frame. The results of that analysis came as no surprise to Nick, Frank and Billy. It merely confirmed what they'd seen in Ben Boyd National Park. The experts concluded that the object was a vast distance from the camera. It was a dull grey colour. It was similar to a bell or dome in its configuration. It was definitely not a helicopter or conventional aircraft. It was, in fact, an object of unknown origin, a true UFO.